Hi, my name is Job, and I'm a therapist that specializes in infidelity and trauma, and I lead groups at the EMS Weekends. Today, I want to talk about components of recovery. A lot of times people will ask me, what does doing the work look like? Or what are the ingredients for recovering from something like this? This is so overwhelming, and I just don't know where to start. These are 3 evidence-based approaches for infidelity recovery. And the first one is going to be individual work. The second one is going to be group work. And then the third one is relationship work. And now I want to touch on each one of those a little bit more specifically. So with individual work, the goal of individual work is to find a therapist that provides a safe, compassionate, empathetic, accepting environment for personal growth. Something I needed when I was going into infidelity recovery was psychoeducation. I had no idea what empathy was, or what compassion was, or tenderness. I always thought those were things that should be for me, but I didn't actually know how to give that. Growing up, attunement and responsiveness was never modeled for me. So finding a good individual counselor was really important because they would model what this looked like for me. And I think a lot of us fall into that category where these things were not taught to us. And so our therapists a lot of times are the first safe relationships that can model those dynamics to us. Another component I had no idea that occurred during infidelity recovery was just basic nervous system biology. Things like what are triggers, trigger cycles, regardless if that was for the unfaithful spouse or the betrayed spouse. I like the word trigger. It gives a sense of awareness of what's happening. However, I also think the word trigger can be a limitation because it's very superficial. What I try to ask people when they say, I'm triggered, is understanding, well, what is the emotion under that trigger? Are you triggered with shame, with fear, with abandonment? Because I think once you start identifying that, you could do some of the work around that trigger. I think another part of education is understanding the whole nervous system, the fight, flight, or freeze, and emotional flooding. So a lot of times when we're engaged with people, our prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, is engaged. When we start getting triggered, especially with shame or anxiety, our brains and our nervous system go into fight or flight. And when we're in fight or flight, our front part of our brain that's engaged with attunement and being able to talk with somebody is offline. Like our nervous system is off to the races. So I think that was really important for me to learn my own cycles of fight or flight. Another important aspect of psychoeducation is co-occurring conditions, okay? Before you could really start getting into infidelity recovery and sex addiction, or like why or how did the unfaithful get to the place where they got, I think it's important to understand what is the relationship with alcohol or chemical abuse. Has there been a history of traumatic brain injuries, clinical depression, anxiety? I think once you identify those co-occurring conditions, then you can start to address those. Another key aspect of individual work is finding a trauma therapist. When we went through this, people that we would go to would advertise that they were trauma therapists, but they were not trained as trauma therapists. And I think that was a huge limitation in our own recovery. Training in trauma looks like they've done work with eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, internal family systems, interpersonal neurobiology, polyvagal. Those are all approaches that take a trauma lens on therapy. A lot of times people will tell me, or they'll think that trauma has to do with being sexually violated, going through war, witnessing a murder, or a natural disaster. I like how Gabor Mate talks about trauma, where he's like, trauma isn't only what happens to you, is trauma can also be what you didn't receive. If we went through, as children, abandonment, neglect, we're feeling lonely and we don't have an adult or our parents to come to attune to us, to relate to us, that could establish neural networks that can be triggered and can feel just as intense as trauma. The second component I want to talk about now is group work. I think group work is really important for the unfaithful because I think you start learning how to relate with other people, especially for men that have been unfaithful. Getting into a group, being authentic, being vulnerable can make some of us want to crawl out of our skin. I know when I started getting into that environment, I would just go and watch the other guys around me share. And I was like, I had never experienced that in my life. But what it started doing is it started changing my brain and to realize this is what a healthy dynamic could look like. Other advantages of group work, it helps us learn how to have personal boundaries on ourselves, how to listen, how to attune. It can model compassion and empathy toward others. So I think group work, I can't state enough the importance of group work. So what does group work look like? It could be 12-step programs. It could be group therapy with a trauma therapist or someone that's going through infidelity recovery. I think group work could also help us identify our own triggers of fear and shame and intimacy avoidance. So the last component I want to talk about when it comes to doing the work is the relationship work. I think the goal is to take everything we've learned in individual work, in group work, and then take that into our relationship. I think it could help us learn how to help our partners when they're going through the trauma of infidelity and betrayal, to help them, support them when they're going through their triggers, to model to them empathy and compassion. When we would go and do our own relationship work, one thing that really struck me was watching our therapist model compassion and patience and attunement and responsiveness to my wife. I wanted to run away from triggers. Like, I grew up in a home where we just didn't talk about it. So the idea that we're going to talk about the betrayal and what happened and how bad it hurt was all a novel concept to me. So watching my therapist display that showed me that it was okay for me to talk about it and to get into the pain with my wife. Relationship work also helps us understand what healthy attachment styles are. Am I avoidantly attached? Am I anxiously attached? Do we get into these cycles where we bounce back and forth, where we're avoidantly and then anxiously attached? What are the cycles in our relationship that we go to of trying to point out each other's flaws or differences and trying to be the right one? The relationship work should help us identify unhealthy attachment and relationship dynamics. It also helps us to determine different types or identify different types of intimacy and the depths of intimacy. For example, I think before this, I would have said intimacy is just sex, or I hear that a lot when I ask people what intimacy is. But there's actually emotional intimacy, there's intellectual intimacy, there's spiritual intimacy. So understanding how those different components of intimacy can be built and reestablished in a relationship is really important. My hope is that if someone is thinking what do I do to do the work? What does that mean? What does infidelity recovery look like? That this is a tool that you can use and implement in doing the work and recovering from what is most likely some people's most devastating life event that they've gone through. Thanks.